Greetings and welcome to the 4th Schurch Family Association of North America Symposium. I'm Jane Schurch in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, and have been involved with the association since the 1980s in different roles. Currently, I'm on the Symposium committee. We welcome you from across Canada and the United States, Switzerland, and Zambia, and beyond. The Symposium series is an effort by the association's executive committee to increase the opportunities for all Schurchs, not only in North America, but beyond, to learn about our fascinating family heritage. Our objective for the Symposium series is to regularly present interesting and little-known information about our family beyond what is published in our twice-a-year newsletter. We are pleased from your feedback that we are meeting our goal of increasing family member interaction, especially during these times when in-person was limited. In fact, we have 20 plus first-time registrations today as we lead off our first live notable Schurch presentation by Dr. Lisa Schurch. However, before I turn the presentation over to Lisa, I'd like to review a few ground rules. First, this event is being recorded by Schurchs about Schurchs and will be archived on YouTube with links from our Schurch Family Association website and Facebook page, which are located at the top of the invitation that you received to this event. Second, all participants at tonight's event have their lines muted. During the presentation and during the Q&A session that will follow the presentation, you are encouraged to use the chat feature where you can type in your question or comment. Lisa will respond as time allows. We have scheduled today's event for 1 hour. And now I'm honored to introduce Lisa by giving you a few bits of information about her background. Dr. Lisa Schurch is a Starman Chair in Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. She also directs the Social Media, Technology, and Peace Building program for the Total Peace Institute based in Tokyo. A former Fulbright Fellow in East and West Africa, Schurch, the author of 11 books, including Social Media Impacts on Conflict and Democracy, The Tectonic Shift. Given current world affairs, the Symposium Committee felt it was particularly timely for Dr. Schurch's presentation today on how technology is affecting conflict and peace. Lisa, I am honored to introduce you now to the rest of our Schurch group.
Thank you so much, Jane. I appreciate that introduction, and it's lovely to be here today with all of you distant relatives in the Schurch Association. My father is, my parents are members of this association, so they often tell me about the history and the progress of people finding out more about where we came from and how we developed the ideas that we have today. And with that, I want to say a word about myself. I am a Mennonite. I grew up as an Anabaptist. And it's interesting because Anabaptists had fascinating views about technology back in the 1500s, which is as far as my family can trace back. And at that point, it had to do with the technology of buttons. So the Mennonites who split off from the Amish believed that it was okay to use the technology of buttons, and the Amish preferred the hook and fastener because military forces were using buttons at the time. So we actually have a long history as Mennonites, and many Schurchs, but not all Schurchs, I understand, are Mennonite, thinking about whether technology brings us together, whether it is a force for peace, or whether it is something that divides us. And so that's the focus of my research about the last 7 years. And I will share some screens, some photographs and some text here shortly, but I think I just want to start by saying most of the next hour is storytelling. So me telling stories about what technology is doing in the world today. The first half of the presentation is focused on how it's fueling conflict. And then the second half of the presentation will focus on the good news of how technology is contributing to peace. And so I will be watching the chat at the bottom. They noted that you can use the chat to ask questions. And about halfway through, once I get done with explaining how how technology is fueling conflict, I'll stop and I'll look at some of the questions and answer some of those before going to the second half. All right, so I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here. All right. So let me just get it into view mode. So yeah, how technologies are fueling conflict and can be resources for peace. And this is basically a research project, and there's three main ideas that you can take away from today's talk. The first one is social media is increasing violent conflict and undermining democracy around the world. The second point is technology can support efforts to save lives and build peace. And the third point is that really the future of technology and whether we can use it to build peace more than people can use it to divide us, it's going to affect all of us. And I'll explain why it's so important to really the future of the planet. So this book that I wrote, actually it's an edited book, and the countries on this map are where the case studies in the book come from. So I worked with a team of 12 authors, primarily from the Southern Hemisphere. So 3 countries in Latin America, that's Venezuela, Brazil, and Colombia, and then 4 countries, Egypt, Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Nigeria. In Africa, we did do Northern Ireland because it's considered a conflict-affected country. We looked at India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka. And I'll just be telling you stories from some of these different countries, but also from other places. And one of the chapters in the book is about Myanmar, because this was the first real wake-up call to the social media technology companies that people, governments were using their platform to actually war on other people. So in Myanmar, this is a report by Reuters. In Myanmar, the government and the military created all these thousands of Facebook accounts in which they started sharing false information, which I'll be referring to throughout this talk as disinformation. So intentionally false information with the goal of achieving their political goals. And their political goal was to get rid of the Muslim community in Myanmar. The ruling party in Myanmar is Buddhist. And they have been persecuting the Muslim population, the Rohingya, for many years. And then they started using Facebook as a weapon. So we say it weaponized Facebook by showing false pictures of Muslims killing Buddhists, which had not happened, and by actually using the platform to call people to go out into the streets and kill Muslims. And it was genocidal level violence in terms of how many people were killed and how much violence came out of those Facebook calls. So this report on Facebook is called Hate Book. And this came out just a few years ago, but the history traces back to 2013 when we really started seeing governments using Facebook as a weapon. In India, many of the same things have happened. The majority there is Hindu, but again, the minority is Muslim. During the pandemic, with the COVID tracking apps, they were particularly targeting Muslim communities, and the government was then suggesting that Muslims were spreading the virus. and that there was something about their religion that had to do with it, which of course was also false, but it also led to direct attacks on Muslim communities within India. In Zimbabwe, there's also been street violence that has been directly traced back to false rumors, lies, disinformation that was spread on social media. So at the University of Oxford, there's a book and it's called Lie Machines, because basically these computers are amplifying, so like an amplification of false information. And researchers at MIT found that false information spreads 6 times as fast as true information on social media. And this is, of course, across the political spectrum, but it should teach us all to be very wary of whatever information we see on social media. Because at this point, the weaponization of social media is so powerful that it's much easier to use these lie machines for harm rather than for good. Some scientists are calling it the collapse of truth. So a fancy word is epistemic insecurity, meaning people, it's hard to know what is true anymore. And this is not just due to social media. There's also other facts or factors. So our mainstream media, what we call legacy media, is also very divided and airing very different points of view. The key point here is that without shared facts, without facts that we can agree upon, it's really hard to do any kind of peace process. It's hard to have a dialogue between people who disagree when we can't have objective sources of news or facts. And we can't really solve global challenges like climate change. And so there's actually good research already that countries that have a national media system, so have limited the amount of diversity in terms of politicization of news, they are much more likely to believe that climate change is happening and being able as a society to pass rules and laws and regulations that are trying to limit the effects of climate change, which is the droughts and the fires and the floods and all of the terrible impacts we're seeing all over the world. So, and this was also true with the pandemic, that the societies who had the most social cohesion, they had the most agreed upon facts and news sources, were the best able to deal with the pandemic. There was not the vaccine disinformation, and there was more agreement about what needed to be done, and far fewer people died in those societies. Technology really, almost since it began, since humans started making tools that worked as systems together, it's always been dual use. And so the computer is no different. Some people are thinking about Facebook in particular as a weapon of mass destruction, that it is dismantling democracy and causing violence in so many countries around the world that we have to think of it as a weapon of mass destruction that needs to be regulated. But these kinds of tools also can be used for scaling, or that means vastly increasing peace-building efforts like dialogue around the world. So later in my talk, I'll share some of the great stories about how technology is being used for peace. Steve Jobs, who you may remember the name, big technologist in Silicon Valley, he said that computers are like bicycles for our mind. And what he meant by that is that they exponentially help us to think so much faster than we can without them. So a human can only run so far, and it takes a lot of energy to run. But what a bicycle does is with much less energy, we can go much farther and faster. So it really maximizes our energy and our efficiency. And a computer is the same way. And so if we think of a computer as a bicycle for the mind, it really just matters which direction we're pedaling. Are we peddling to hurt people or to bring people together and heal divides? What's so interesting about a company like Facebook, but also other social media, is that it's almost the first time that there's been a massive corporation devoted to bringing people together. So the mission of Facebook is giving people the power to share and make the world more open and connected. So this is a great mission. And I think, with the best intentions, the owners and the staff at Facebook continue to really believe that social media can be a positive thing. I myself am on social media and it does connect me with my friends and my family. But it also connects a lot of other people and enables harms to happen. And so there's been all of these books published about the harms that Facebook is doing. So these are just 3 books, the covers of 3 books. An Ugly Truth, Inside Facebook's Battle for Domination, Anti-Social Media, How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Us, etc. This is just a handful of some of the literature that's come out just in the last few years, really detailing the scale and the scope of harm that technology is bringing. And part of the story is a little bit more complex. I'm going to try to simplify this as much as possible, but it really, to understand why Facebook is causing harm, we have to understand how it's designed and what the profit model is. So it's designed, the Facebook, if you look at the front page newsfeed, the colors, the Facebook likes, or the emotional reactions that you're allowed to post, all of this is designed to keep users' attention, because user attention is what makes money for these companies. So they need us to be on these platforms as long as possible every day, because that's how they make money. And there's kind of 2 things here. One, they're showing us advertisements. So they're selling ads on these platforms. And when we watch them, when we're online, that makes money for the company. But the second part is where you might have heard in the news, is where all the surveillance and privacy comes in, because Facebook is watching everything you do, not only on the Facebook platform, but everything you do on your computer. It is able to see what websites you're going to, what things you're wanting to buy, who your friends are, what your religion is, what your age is, what your region of the world is. So they're gathering all this vast amount of information. And there's half of the planet. So over, almost half of the people on the planet are on Facebook. So they're collecting individual profiles on all of these people. They have massive data banks of our private information, which then they sell to advertisers to enable this targeting, so that you get specific ads tailored for who you are, where you live in the world, what you're interested in. And advertisers love this. And of course, this is corporations who are able to sell you hammocks and picnic tables or anything you might be searching for or looking for. But it's also political interest. So political actors can also target you with this information. So Facebook is selling access to this information to both corporate advertisers as well as political interests. Now, part of the design of the platform is that false and inflammatory posts garner the most attention. So they have found this over and over again. And so some people not only call the Facebook a lie machine, but an outrage machine, because what we see on Facebook, when we decide to comment on something or share something, it mostly has to do with whether we are outraged. That's the emotion that motivates us to act the most. And so you have more and more outrage and really divisive rhetoric discussion on Facebook and other social media platforms, Twitter, etc. And then the third part of this is that the algorithm, so this is kind of the mathematical formulation that takes your private data and figures out what is likely to keep you on these platforms longer. And it's going to show that the algorithm is going to choose from all of your friends and all of the information that you could see, which is a lot usually, and they're going to choose the information that you're going to see that's most likely to keep your attention. And then they're going to recommend groups to you, they're going to recommend videos, and the whole idea is keeping you on this platform as long as possible and getting more and more information about you, which they can sell to more and more advertisers. So this profit model ends up like, I said, lies spread 6 times faster than the truth. And that's partly because you have the design, you have the neuroscience going into the design, and then you have the algorithms, which then just are fueling our outrage and division online. So it's not just about Facebook. There's sort of issues with Google and YouTube and many of the companies. One of the facts that has come out quite frequently about YouTube is that if you watch a YouTube video, on the side of the screen, there's all of these recommended videos. And what they tend to recommend is the most extreme information. So this is very different kind of information than an encyclopedia. So this is where social media and technology is really perverting the truth. Because if you went into an encyclopedia and you said, is the world round? And you wanted to look up what's the research on the shape of the earth, the encyclopedia has been vetted by many scientists, and it's going to give you the truth that, this is all the scientific calculations that we have, that we know that the earth is round. But if you ask that question on YouTube, unless they've corrected it, what you get recommended is all the flat earth conspiracy theories. So all of the, unscientific groups that are not trained in any kind of real science or experiments, but often come from actually political interests or economic interests, and they just want you to click on that video because YouTube and other platforms are monetized. So if you click on the video, some money goes to the people who created it. So the flat earth conspiracy has made millions of dollars for people who are creating this because it's being recommended by YouTube, which knows the most inflammatory, outrageous information is going to get you to stay on the platform longer. So Apple CEO Tim Cook says, we should think about different kinds of technology because Apple's profit model rests on selling software to customers. Apple doesn't get any financial benefit from outrageous posts or from disinformation, but Facebook's profit model actually does benefit from false information. And so Apple's Tim Cook says, basically, at Facebook, you're not the customer, you're the product that is being sold. So this little cartoon of 2 pigs having this conversation, isn't it great? We have to pay for nothing for the barn. Yeah, they even give us food for free. And this is trying to get to Tim Cook's point, is that these different profit models are underpinning why some technology is far more harmful than others, in terms of whether it really respects users' privacy and whether it's actually having this divisive effect on society. I want to talk about Ukraine a little bit because there have been many news stories over the last few months as this war rages on about the kind of disinformatia, which is Russian disinformation attacks, not only on Ukraine, but throughout Europe, actually in the US, I'll talk about that later, and then also in across Africa and other parts of the world, where Russia is really interested in dividing societies and undermining democracy. And they're very threatened, as we've heard, about Ukraine's democracy right on their border. And so they've not only used malware, sort of like computer attacks on the electrical grid, the hospitals in Ukraine, but it's really cognitive warfare. It's warfare on our mind, which I'll talk about in a minute. So yeah, how an entire nation became Russia's test lab for cyber war. So in some ways, people think Russia's just getting ready. This doesn't end with Ukraine. The information warfare is actually looking at how do we do this farther. Just to stay on Ukraine for a minute, Ukrainians and actually many of the countries around Russia have been fighting this Russian disinformation for over a decade now, and they're very good at it. And so there's things that Americans can learn about disinformation from them. But the people in Ukraine have also been using computers and social media as a way of having dialogue between people who were pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian. And so they've been using computers for dialogue. And I'll have more good stories like that later on in this presentation. NATO, of course, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has put out this manual about what is happening in the world, and they're calling it cognitive warfare. So it's information warfare, the brain being the battlefield of the 21st century. And they've done a lot of analysis of how Russia has been investing in cognitive warfare, where the future conflicts will likely occur amongst the people, as we see here in the United States, a little bit in Canada. I don't know where everyone else is situated today, but yeah, like this idea of turning societies against each other. It's the classic divide and conquer strategy, really. And, you know, what Russia is doing, what China is doing, but now dozens of other authoritarian countries, is really perfecting the use of technology for three kind of authoritarian dictatorship roles. And one is mass surveillance. So everywhere you go in China, there's a camera looking at you. Not everywhere, that's an exaggeration, but a lot of places. And of course, a few years ago, Chinese cameras that were sold to the US were taken down because people realized, oh, actually, the Chinese government may still have access to all this surveillance of the people in other countries that they've sold these cameras to as well. They're creating cyber troops and troll armies to plant disinformation, which I said a little bit about, and I'll say a bit more on the next slide. And then there's a distraction strategy, which I'll talk about here. At the University of Oxford in England, they are keeping track of all the different countries around the world that are using what they call computational propaganda. So this is planting disinformation in other people's news ecosystems. So trying to get CNN, Fox News, all the different CNBC, all the different news channels to pick up these false information stories that are aiming to divide people. And they want to suppress truth, real information, discredit people and discredit different news agencies, and they want to drown them out. And sort of drowning them out is China's main strategy within China. So they use surveillance, but then they also, anytime the public starts talking about a political issue that's related to a criticism of the government, you know, all of a sudden there's all this Hello Kitty, these fluff news stories, which is really just trying to distract the public, get them to stop talking about political issues. So many of these strategies have been written about by other authors as well, like War, the Weaponization of Social Media, War in 140 Characters, which really focuses on how Twitter is being used as a weapon. And in the United States, the US government, the Congress has held hearings on this because this was a bipartisan, Republican, Democrat, all the US intelligence agencies said Russia interfered in the 2016 election. They were trying to dissuade African-American voters. They were telling Democrats to vote for Jill Stein, and they were trying to shift the Republicans' support away from Ted Cruz and other Republican candidates and elect Donald Trump. We don't know why that is yet, but this congressional hearing and this report from the Senate, again, bipartisan, really documents that they were very successful. And unfortunately, because they were so successful in 2016, the amount of disinformation floating in the world today is hundreds of times more than it was in 2016. So there is a disinformation industry. Not only are countries creating this, but all kinds of shadow political interests are creating false information and spreading it through memes and other ways on social media. In Venezuela, they're collecting people's information. In Ethiopia, they're just shutting down the internet. In Egypt, they're doing the same. Authoritarians are using the internet to propel the worst parts of humanity. Of course, in New Zealand, we saw what happens when a white supremacist got the Norwegian manifesto on white supremacy and from Dylan Roof. So that now the internet is connecting all these terror groups. And often it's white supremacists working together to share hatred of Muslims and people of color. And so actually New Zealand has taken on these big tech giants saying, if Facebook is a terrorist recruitment platform, we need better regulations and rules about this, about who can post what and what's allowed on these platforms. So let me just stop there and just see what kind of questions we have. Message from Mike, forwarded by Ray. Free speech is under attack, and Myanmar is a perfect example of the problems that arise when government puts out the message they want heard. Open dialogue is essential to a free country to keep both sides in check. Yes, so this is a concern, and it's primarily coming from Republicans that Facebook is censoring. I know from Facebook's rules that they're spending a huge amount of money trying to figure out how to censor white supremacist groups, political groups spreading false information, and how to keep open the channels of dialogue and free communication that is not intending to harm people. Now, we can't have totally free speech because this all started with ISIS, and again in this New Zealand case, because there's always limits of free speech. Actually, the US Constitution did not mean that anybody could incite others to use violence. So, you know, the right of free speech ends, if it's a fist, it ends at the tip of my nose. So as soon as you start to hurt other groups with your free speech, that's where the limit, the courts have found there to be a limit. And so right now we're talking about a lot of different possibilities for how we can have citizen panels who are making these decisions rather than these big corporations, because it really shouldn't be a private corporation deciding what is free speech and what is not. So I agree with all the concerns from the conservatives in the US that we need a better process for deciding what is censorship of legitimate political discourse and what is necessary to make sure our Facebook feed doesn't have ISIS videos, you know, beheading Christians, which happened in the past, and which is where the censorship started. And it's also, you know, what happened in Myanmar is that Facebook realized, oh, they needed to do far more to censor, in that case, the government from trying to mobilize people to kill Muslims there. So it's a very difficult issue. There's a lot of people working on this. And yeah, I can talk more about that at the end. Let me switch now to telling some good stories about how technology is improving human safety, helping humans make decisions and heal divides, find common ground. So in Lithuania, I mentioned these countries that are around Russia have been fighting what they call Russian trolls for over a decade now, because Russia was experimenting with planting this false information. And they call themselves the Lithuanian elves. And there's like 30,000, maybe more by this point. This news story is a few years old, from 2017, the Lithuanian elves fighting Russian trolls online. So basically citizens are standing up and saying, we're going to help identify what is false information, point people to credible sources of information, and make sure that Russia can't spread, false lies that are antagonizing and actually trying to mobilize people to violence. So that's Lithuania. Let's go to Germany, where there is another civil society movement called #IamHere. And this is a movement started by the German people to show solidarity and empathy to victims of cyberbullying and hate speech. And again, most of the time it was Muslim immigrants who were receiving a lot of negative hate speech and bullying online. And this movement would just flood a post just with the #IamHere. I am in solidarity with you. We welcome people who are migrants into Germany. And so it's become a mass movement now, not only within Germany, but also across Europe. And there's now branches of it in the United States and Canada. Other countries are focusing on digital media literacy, and this is partly to combat online hate speech, but also to help young people determine what's a credible source of information. So Cyber Guardians was this training pack that was being taught to youth about how to understand what's on social media and what might be the profit motives of why somebody is posting what we call clickbait. They get paid if you click on this story about some political character going to jail or doing something terrible. So just trying to help people understand again the profit model for social media, why there's so much false information, and to be a bit more wary what they see. In Israel and Palestine, they are using video games called Games for Peace, which is Minecraft. If any of you have children or grandchildren that play video games, very popular one. They were bridging the Palestinian-Israeli divide by bringing kids together on these joint video games. In Jordan, they were using social media apps to connect refugees with local communities. So in Amman, Jordan, Facebook was a space where new refugees from Syria could find jobs, could find clothing, could find people to work with them in terms of getting around the city and trying to figure out how to live in this new society. This is an online quiz that was made by a group here in the United States called More in Common. And they're trying to bridge the political divide between Republicans and Democrats. And what this does is it challenges our perceptions. So do you have a yawning perception gap, or are you in sync? So the question really is, do you accurately understand what people from the other side of the aisle believe? And how distorted are your views? Because media, legacy media, mainstream media is so divided in the United States, people are hearing very different things, and sometimes they're not true on the legacy media or the TV or the radio too. So this perception gap actually goes by actual political platforms and legislative records and checks whether our perceptions of each other are accurate or not. So you can see, and it's kind of called reality testing, whether we have actually more in common. This is a group, Moonshot CVE, which is searching Google searches and looking at which counties in the United States where there are armed militias, but also where people are searching for words or terms that have to do with white supremacist militias that may be interested in using violence. And again, the government is surveilling these, and I think most of us want them to be looking at any kind of terror group, whatever religion they're part of, because we don't want a civil war in this country, and we need to be able to identify where people are arming themselves and looking to start a war. This Rauhowa, racial holy war, is actually a term that's been around the United States for quite some time. And it was coined actually by a Mennonite who was a leader of the white supremacist movement here. That's another story. That's other research that I've done. Okay, early warning of violence. So in Kenya, ushahidi was used back actually in the 2000s for the election there to identify. What it did is it was this phone app, and wherever people could see that there were people on the streets that were starting to argue with each other about the election or even threaten each other and use violence against each other, citizens could immediately report this. And the information went actually two places. It went to the police, and it also went to a trained mediation first responder team. And it was, the first responder team was actually people from the National Council of Churches. It was church leaders who could go and use their church authority to diffuse the conflict, or they were trained community mediators who could go and immediately try to intervene before there was mass violence. So Ushahidi was this great phone app that was really was preventing election violence in this country, where some people have said, you know, it could have been another Rwanda if there was not a mass effort to prevent violence in the country around the elections. In Syria, a technology company called Hala Systems runs a program called Sentry that provides early warning of airstrikes to civilians. So basically they have these sensors now all over the town. And when the sensor detects an airplane that is armed and weaponized and is going to drop a bomb, civilians have about a 60-second warning to get into shelters where they may be able to survive an attack. So it's an early warning of violence. But also in Syria, the Carter Center is mapping the conflict, and it's able to collect vast amounts of online data to visualize the shifting movements of armed forces, because this is really helpful then when the Carter Center goes to the mediation table with the parties in Syria in Geneva, in Switzerland, to try to figure out where are the armed groups, what are they saying at the diplomatic table, and what is actually happening on the ground. In Colombia, you know, they've had a peace process there. They're trying to recover from decades of war. The British Council is sponsoring this storytelling for peace building, where young people get to tell their stories of growing up during a war and their stories of resilience, of how they are managing to heal and come together again in the country. At the United Nations, there's all kinds of use of digital technology to improve mediation, to improve peace processes, to widen the amount of participation people can have. Others have commented, as I'm quoting here in these news stories, that things like Airbnb and Uber and these things we're starting to share our homes and our automobiles. And these technologies are creating a way for people to trust each other so that they can stay in somebody's home, because you're going by the reputation that somebody has garnered on technology platforms. So this sharing economy, you know, some people are saying it's promoting peace as well through corporate action. In Canada, there's this really interesting company called Smart Settle, which has developed robot mediators and sort of digitalized mediation formats. And what's so fascinating is the research, which I'm showing here on the next screen, is that when people have disputes, and this can be everything from family, you know, disputes over where the children live, to community disputes where people are taking each other to court. When robots are allowed to mediate these conflicts using the best practices of mediation, which is now a science that, you know, we've developed over the years, how do you get people to reach agreement? they're finding actually that robots are more successful than actual humans in mediation. So people are having a more positive perception of the mediation experience, are experiencing more satisfaction with the outcome, and thought that the mediator's advice was more useful when coming from a robot, which, you know, in terms of neutrality and objectivity, you would be getting more objectivity in some ways from a robot than a human being. And finally, the best case scenario is what's happened in the country of Taiwan, which has digitalized its democratic process. And they have their own digital minister in Taiwan, which is using this platform called Polis, which is enabling large-scale discussions. And basically, they've used it now on 30, 40 different political issues where the people were very polarized and couldn't agree on a solution. And the technology platform actually structures it so people are incentivized to try to find a solution that not only meets their own interests, but also meets the interests of other stakeholders who care about the issue. So it's a technology that incentivizes that creativity and a common ground. And they've been able to reach legislation, successful legislation, bipartisan legislation, 80% of the time. So this kind of technology is called computational democracy. And this is just an example of how in the future we might be able to make decisions about what content Facebook should moderate, or, you know, what our schools should teach in terms of our history, or all the different issues that divide us in our political sphere. How could we use technology to help us talk to each other in a way that we can understand each other and actually work for creative solutions? With a variety of other groups and with Facebook and Twitter and some of the big technology companies, we are now forming this Council on Technology and Social Cohesion, which is trying to bring these new ideas about technology forward. We have great investors. What's so interesting is that the big venture capital funds have now decided they want to invest in what's called peace tech, technology to foster social cohesion, recognizing that technology has caused so much division. So I'm going to stop there again with my conclusions. Social media is increasing violent conflict and undermining democracy around the world. Technology can support efforts to save lives and build peace. And really, the future of technology affects all of us. So I'll stop there and see whether we have more questions. If you'd like to add anything, please feel free to join the chat there at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. I'll answer this one from Isa. Technology was used in North Africa during the Arab Spring in Egypt and Tunisia and other countries to challenge dictatorship, and many people died. Can we say technology was used as a resource for peace or violence? That's a great, I usually tell the story of the Arab Spring, so I didn't in this presentation. But absolutely, people were so excited that Facebook and Twitter were going to be these tools to spread democracy, because, you know, human rights activists, democracy activists around the world were organizing and recruiting new members also on these platforms. And so that was back in 2010, 2011. There was a lot of optimism. We call it now techno-optimism. And so that Arab Spring, those good stories were, so right after that was 2013, when we found out that in Myanmar, Facebook had been used to mobilize genocidal violence. And so the last 10 years now, it's been sad story after sad story about the scope of what has been happening on Facebook, in particular, again, because it's the largest platform, but actually all the platforms have these problems. So yeah, I don't see a lot of other messages here. Please feel free to type something in. I can also just continue talking and tell you some other stories. Another place that you might be interested in hearing about is the Philippines. Maria Ressa is a journalist in the Philippines. She won the Nobel Peace Prize this year. And she won the Nobel Peace Prize based on her concern that Facebook was being used to promote dictatorship, Duterte's dictatorship of the Philippines, to undermine democracy. And Maria Ressa, the journalist, she runs a news agency there that, again, is trying to provide accurate information. And the Duterte regime has been censoring her. So she's been imprisoned, and she's been sort of facing a lot of opposition and trying to get real news coverage. Can you remind, there's a question here, can you, Mary Lou Clausen, can you remind us of the Canadian company's name who used robots for mediation? Yes, it's called Smart Settle, I believe. Let me just look that up. It's based in, yeah, Smart Settle. It's based in Vancouver, I believe. Another question. Under the Privacy Act, this information can cause a lot of damage to individuals when accessing bank accounts. Yes. And I think all of us are really, we need to be worried about privacy and the level of surveillance, what people online know about us and what they can look up about us. And it's getting, you know, the stealing, the identity theft is increasing, because now online people can find out so much about us too, also because of what we're sharing on social media. So it's partly our own responsibility, and we need to take personal responsibility as well to make sure our settings are tight, and that we can really know who has what information about us. Another question from Joan Schurch. How can information be regulated without censoring what is presented to the general population? Who will be responsible for the regulation? So this is what is being discussed literally in every government around the world. So it's really difficult. So in a country like Ethiopia, you know, there's a terrible civil war there right now. And the president of Ethiopia has been putting on Facebook, again, just like the government in Myanmar, sort of false allegations with the idea of instigating more violence against different ethnic groups in that conflict. And when, you know, things start coming on, when Facebook starts moderating, so censoring that information, recognizing that this is going to get people killed by spreading false allegations about ethnic groups that are not verified, and there's no news sources for them. It's purely government propaganda. So Facebook would censor that, and then what would happen is the Ethiopian president would shut down the internet altogether, and he would say, well, if you're going to censor me, then I'm just going to turn off the internet. And that also then causes other problems for people who use the internet to try to get information about what is happening. So this is a very complex situation right now. On the one hand, real people are dying because of the false information that's being spread on social media. You know, in this country, the false allegations about the election being stolen have caused threats against election officials across the country, death threats. And so, you know, Facebook is trying to figure out, do you censor that? Because there's real harms that are being done. And so governments are trying to figure out, how should regulation happen? Who should make the decisions, and how should those decisions be made about what content is allowed and what is not allowed? Because saying that we will not censor, or we call it moderation, you know, saying that nothing will be moderated means that people will die, because false rumors and cyberbullying will create a situation where people will falsely hear information and go and kill people. So it's difficult. Another question, what are some basic tactics you use in teaching to help students develop more critically consume media. So I think a lot of it, even just this 1 hour presentation, hopefully gives you all, the audience, a little bit more understanding of what is happening on the computers, and sort of why there is this sort of financial and political incentive to spread false information. That there's political interests and financial interests that are making millions and millions of dollars. For example, on these false cures for COVID, those people have profited endlessly from advertisements on social media that they posted, for false cures. So time for us to wrap up. Jane, thank you so much. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Lisa, for the amazing work that you are doing for taking the time to inform us of the positive and negative effects of technology and social media. This helps us to, I believe, be better peace builders and peacekeepers. I only have one regret, though, that I did not know you when you studied at Conrad Grebel College here in Waterloo, and were in walking distance from my home. So please know there is a warm welcome awaiting you if you decide to include a visit to Waterloo in your future plans. I'd also like to thank the other members of the Symposium Committee, Carrie Adams and Doug Schurch, for all of the time and effort they have spent, not only with this symposium, but the previous ones. And a specific thanks to Ray and Joan Schurch in Pennsylvania for producing this event today. Finally, I'd like to thank our audience for your presence and your input in the Q&A. And if you have a topic of interest, please send your idea to schirchsymposium@gmail.com, and one of our committee members will be in touch. Please check our website for other information on our upcoming reunion, August 4th and 5th in Fort Erie, and information about subscribing to the Schurch newsletter. Our next notable Schurch Symposium will be in November with Jerry Schurch, former Cleveland Browns National Football League All-Star, who will be sharing about his career after football on youth mentoring, generativity, and adult development. We hope that you will join us. Until then, continue to bless and be blessed, and in true Swiss style, auf Wiedersehen.